My name is Anton Ovrutsky. I'm a senior threat research engineer at Sumo Logic, and you can find me on Twitter using, or X, Anton loves DNB is my handle. Love to talk shop, so just hit me up if you have any questions or anything about this talk or anything in general. Happy to chat with you. So just diving into the actual presentation here, and to kind of set the stage, I thought it would be kind of a fun exercise to look at a Google Trends search and look at cloud computing and ransomware, with the blue line being cloud computing and the red line being ransomware. And with how kind of like disruptive and in the news ransomware has been, I kind of thought that the trend would be kind of similar, right? That the lines would kind of match and would be on the same level. But I was pretty surprised to discover that ransomware still kind of pales in comparison to the general popularity and focus on cloud computing. And we could look at a ton of other data sources as well. And all of these data sources would kind of point us in the same direction, that cloud computing is kind of top of mind for various enterprises, businesses, IT leaders, and things like that. And there's a whole bunch of lenses that we could look at cloud computing through. But in this presentation, we're going to focus on the defensive aspects of cloud computing, including how we, as information security professionals who are on the defensive end of the InfoSec spectrum, think about, or at least kind of should be directionally be thinking about threats to cloud environments. So turning back to the question at the start of this presentation, does the endpoint still matter in a cloud security world? And if it does, where does it fit in with our threat models, queries, detection strategies, et cetera? And I'm sure everyone is kind of waiting on bated breath for the answer, but we could go ahead and save you a lot of time and answer this hypothetical question with a very emphatic yes. The endpoint obviously still does matter in the cloud security world and in the cloud security paradigm. And as I'll hopefully demonstrate in this presentation, the endpoint can often act as a gateway or entryway into a cloud environment. So having said that, let's do a quick association test altogether. And this is especially relevant for folks who kind of live and breathe MITRE attack. If I went ahead and mentioned the tactic of credential access, normally the technique that comes to mind is OS credential dumping. And obviously the tool that's associated with this is, of course, everyone's favorite Kiwi, Mimikatz. So let's dive a bit deeper into this kind of dynamic and compare two credential access techniques. The first one being OS credential dumping from LSASS memory, and the second being steal web session cookie. So for the LSASS memory dumping technique, we could see about 55 procedural examples in attack, followed by 4 detections and about 7 mitigations. And at least this was the case when I made these slides a couple weeks ago. And if you're a fan of Sigma, there's about 78 rules that cover this particular technique. So quite a bit of Sigma rules that cover LSASS memory credential dumping theft. And it kind of makes sense that this particular technique has a lot of attention given to it, as most EDR tools are all over this type of technique. And it's been known for many years. Obviously, everyone knows what Mimikatz is and everything like that. So let's take a look at our second technique using the same kind of methodology here. So looking at the steal web session cookie technique through that same lens of, the MITRE analysis, we can already see a pretty stark difference. And we only see 10 procedural examples this time, 3 mitigations and 2 detections, with only 1 Sigma rule being available. So does this mean that this particular technique, stealing a web session cookie, is any less risky than OS credential dumping? And as we'll see in an upcoming demo, a stolen cookie from a web browser could provide a threat actor with a pathway to a cloud environment. And in many cases, the cookie can be stolen from a user who does not have privileged rights on their endpoint, but do have these rights to a cloud environment. And this dynamic is what OWASP calls a trust boundary. And the technique of stealing a web session cookie can potentially aid threat actors in crossing such a trust boundary. So in other words, this is a significantly risky technique that is worth our attention. So let's dig a little bit deeper into the attack data and take a look at the data source component. And this is kind of one of my favorite things to do with the MITRE attack data set, is to analyze the data source component of it. And if we go ahead and query the MITRE attack enterprise JSON file and look at how many data sources are tied to steal web session cookie versus dumping LSASS memory, we can see a huge and stark difference where the cookie technique only has 2 data source components, whereas the LSASS memory dumping technique has about double that amount. And this is an interesting dynamic, and I would argue that in the world of cloud, a stolen cookie is equally, if not more risky than a stolen LSASS memory dump. But let's not take my word for it. Let's challenge that assumption a little bit and look at these 2 techniques from a threat actor point of view. So when we go ahead and do that, when we look at these 2 techniques from a threat actor point of view, who has a choice of performing one or the other of these techniques, and we look at the first row there being EDR, meaning endpoint detection and response products, these controls and products have, over the years, actually become very good at detecting in-memory credential theft of LSASS. In addition to that, these days, there's a whole bunch of hardening options available on Windows operating systems for hardening your LSASS process. And obviously, I know there's bypasses for all that kind of stuff, but overall, this is generally a category that EDR products are actually pretty good at. If we go ahead and look at the 2 techniques from a logging standpoint, so in other words, what telemetry is generated by the system when either of these techniques is performed, we noted earlier that there's many Sigma rules available for LSASS memory dumping, but a lot fewer for cookie theft. And this is not Sigma's fault at all. This is not the fault of the contributors to Sigma who volunteer their time and everything, as even when we looked at the MITRE data sources, we noted that there was just fewer detection opportunities for something like cookie theft. In terms of reward, and this is reward kind of to the threat actor, a stolen browser cookie typically provides authenticated browser sessions to the threat actor. And these days in 2023, an LSASS memory dump may or may not contain clear text credentials or other credential materials such as keys or Kerberos tickets or whatever. And in networks that are appropriately hardened against lateral movement techniques, these credentials can be of little use to the threat actor, or at least, that's what we all hope. That's the best case scenario that we're all kind of striving towards. Looking at the final category there, exfiltration options, a lot of EDR products will flag when an LSASS memory dump file is detected on disk. And I know there's other options available to exfiltrate that kind of thing, but browser cookies are just a flat JSON file typically when they're stolen from a web browser. And this often doesn't trigger the same type of EDR or even DLP rules as an LSASS dump would. So from a threat actor perspective, if we look at these 2 techniques from their point of view, in many cases, cookie theft may present a more attractive and less restrictive pathway for threat actors to go ahead and achieve their evil goals. And to kind of go ahead and bring this dynamic back to our cloud theme, just go ahead and think about how users in your organization access the cloud. They do so via a browser of some kind or a terminal. So now that I have hopefully convinced all of you that browser cookie theft and other types of non-LSASS credential dumping techniques present an attractive pathway for a threat actor, and not only that, they may present a more fruitful access for them as well with less monitoring in place. So given all these dynamics that we talked about, what are some other weak spots or soft spots that exist on endpoints where credentials like to hang out? And this is obviously not an exhaustive list, but some areas that I've come across and have seen that contain very critical credentials are file shares. Networks are typically filled with a lot of file shares, and this is an area where tech debt shines pretty brightly, where systems get upgraded, credentials get left behind on file shares. This kind of thing happens all the time. On files on endpoints is another area. This is your keys, tokens, or even plain text credentials like to hang out in files called keys.txt or password.txt. And these files typically have pretty limited monitoring around them and a limited amount of governance wrapped around them. Even though administrative controls exist, telling users, hey, don't store your password in a file called password.txt on your desktop, we all know that this kind of thing still happens. The other area that I covered pretty heavily so far is browser cookies. And as I mentioned, these are a very attractive target for threat actors. And the final area here is cloud tokens. And these are things like your AWS or Azure CLI credentials. And we'll see in some upcoming demos and screenshots that I have that these credentials usually hang out on endpoints for users who access or administer cloud resources, and they're stored in either plain text or are encrypted with DP API. However, with DP API, you can go ahead and reverse that encryption, which I'll show you in a second. So let's go on a little journey all together and cover some alerting, detection, and hunting strategies for each one of these weak spots. So we'll start with file shares, and the event IDs that you'll need here are your 5145 and 5140s. These will provide you with visibility into what share was accessed and which file was accessed within that file share. In terms of detection strategies, we can go ahead and start with a relatively simple alert, just looking at a high number of failed or successful access events to file shares. In typical Windows networks, you might find that service accounts exhibit this kind of behavior. So my advice here is to start with a pretty broad query and then go ahead and just whittle that down and exclude or put your service accounts maybe into a different alerting structure or something like that. You can also combine these access events with a type of honeypot file or a honeypot file share and raise or lower an alerting severity score if this file or file share is actually accessed when you know that it shouldn't be. And of course, this is a step that a lot of blue teamers miss sometimes, is the validation piece. You always want to validate your alerting assumptions and make sure that they actually work the way that you expect them to. So for file shares specifically, we could use tools such as Snaffler or SharpShares. And one thing to keep in mind here is that you probably want to run these tools from user accounts who have different levels of access to your file shares, because you want to test for not only what file shares you can access, but what kinds of files are actually hanging out within those file shares as well. So in the screenshot above, we can kind of see what a Snaffler execution looks like. And below that, we have a sumo logic query that looks for a high share count coming from a username or IP address. And in the query, we're setting a little flag when the high failure count threshold is reached. In this case, it's over 30 file shares. And of course, this query logic can be translated into other SIM formats, your Sentinels, your Splunk, or what have you. And the parameters can be tweaked to match your particular environment. So in some environments, 30 file shares may not be a lot. In others, it may be a ton. So this kind of thing is highly dependent on your particular environment, how many shares you have, how your service accounts behave, and things like that. So turning our attention to files on endpoints, the data that's required here is Windows object auditing. And this needs to be turned on via group policy as well as per the file that you want to audit. And we'll be diving a bit into these events a little bit later. However, for Linux operating systems, you want to monitor the OpenNat syscall via audit D, or even better, something like Laurel, which helps streamline and stitch together audit D logs. If you haven't taken a look at Laurel and you are into Linux threat hunting and things like that, I highly recommend that you take a look at it. In terms of detection strategies, we can again look at file access of a honeypot file, access of known sensitive files by unknown processes, or generally rare access of files. And for validation, this will kind of depend pretty heavily on what kind of files you're monitoring, what kind of keys and tokens, et cetera, you're monitoring. However, one recommendation I have here is to try to access the file, not normally through, Explorer or Bash or anything like that, but try to access it through a C2 framework of some kind so that the process flow that is generated looks a little bit different. And if you don't want to mess with setting up C2 frameworks, nobody does, check out the SANS C2 edition matrix, C2 matrix edition VM. I always get that name confused. It comes with a whole bunch of C2 frameworks pre-installed and ready to go for you. So building off the alerting and detection strategies discussed when looking at suspicious or malicious sensitive file access on an endpoint, let's look at cloud tokens specifically. And this screenshot shows you an example of an Azure token that is found on a workstation for a user or developer or administrator of whoever utilizes the Azure CLI. And the token is encrypted with DPAPI. However, a user has the rights necessary to actually decrypt this file. And in our example, we're using Mimikatz to perform this operation, but there's other tools that can do this kind of thing. And this kind of begs the question, once you kind of see this kind of thing, is how do we know where this file even is on a user's file system? And once we know where it is, how can we set the relevant SACL auditing on the file so that we can get an alert or at least get some telemetry generated when this file is accessed, when mimikatz.exe accesses your Azure token? How do you know when that happens? So we've spent some time discussing the event IDs necessary to alert on file access. However, in order to find the relevant keys and tokens that store cloud credentials on an endpoint, we, the Sumo Threat Research team, has released a couple helper scripts to help you in this and to help you automate this process. The first script is called set SACL, which runs on Windows. And this script builds pretty heavily off of Roberto Rodriguez's work and his script called set audit rule. And Roberto's script provides the functionality to set SACL auditing via PowerShell. And our script uses that to actually crawl the file system, find AWS, Azure, GCP, and kubeconfig files. And if they're found, and if they don't already have a SACL on them, the script will go ahead and set a SACL on it so that you get some telemetry generated when the processes actually go ahead and touch these files. On the Linux side, we released a pretty simple bash script called trufflehog to audit D. And this script takes trufflehog output. And if you haven't heard of trufflehog, it's very good at finding keys, tokens, and things like that, both on file systems and in CI/CD pipelines as well. So the helper script here takes the output that trufflehog gives you, and it parses it, and then it adds those entries into audit D. So again, you get some telemetry generated when a threat actor tries to exfiltrate your cloud credentials. And both these scripts and the relevant write-ups can be found on our Sumo Threat Research blog. I don't have the links in the slides, but if you just Google Sumo Cloud Credentials, the blogs will come up and the links for the scripts will be in there. So once you have the data collected, you've run these awesome scripts, you're messing around with SACLs, you got the open syscalls going to your SIB, you're rocking and rolling. Once you have that data collected, you can actually go ahead and baseline the events using various factors, such as which users are accessing particular files, what processes are accessing these files, which IP addresses, what time of day. All these factors can be utilized on their own or in tandem with other events in order to kind of bubble up malicious activity. So once we have our baselines established, we're in a much better position to go ahead and actually craft alerts. And here's what one looks like in our CloudSIM platform. We can see the cloud credential file that was accessed, what process accessed the cloud credential file, what user performed the operation, as well as the relevant MITRE tags and all that. So at this point, we spent some time looking at the shadowy and perhaps lesser logged areas of networks, specifically around file share access and looking at cloud credential access and things like that. And at this point, let's turn our attention to browser cookie theft. And here I just have a quick narrated demo that's recorded that'll play so that you get a sense of how this technique works and what the impact of it is. So hopefully the video plays. Yeah. So we start off on a victim machine, and this is where we're going to be actually stealing cookies from. And we're going to be doing this manually through WebSockets. So the first step, we'll start Chrome with the debugging port enabled on port 9333 in this case. And once we do that, we'll see Chrome pop up. and we'll go ahead and browse to the Azure portal just to show that this user is authenticated to the portal. And then once we confirm that, we can actually go ahead and curl the debugging endpoint that we just started. And from here, we'll grab a WebSocket URL, and then we'll just use a WebSocket client, WSC, to go ahead and connect to that WebSocket URL. And then we'll send Chrome a request telling it to return all its cookies back to us. And once we do that, the network.getAllCookies command, we run it, and then Chrome just happily returns back the cookies that it has stored in JSON format. So at this point, we'll copy and paste it, exfiltrate it via OneDrive or Dropbox or something like that, and we'll browse to the attacker machine. And this machine is where we're going to be loading the cookies onto. And as we could see below the notepad window here, that this computer does not have an authenticated Azure session. So we'll go ahead and open up our Cookie Bro extension, browse to the cookie editor, and then we will load the JSON file that we just stole from the victim machine. And once we do that, we'll see that the cookies were imported, all good to go. And once we refresh the Azure portal, it'll complain a little bit. And I think this is due to a time delta. But once we click try again, we will happily be brought to an authenticated Azure portal session on a machine that did not have the credentials. They just had the cookies. And the thing to point out about this too is that depending on how your conditional access policies are set up in your Azure or Entra tenant, this could potentially be an MFA bypass as well. So a pretty impactful technique, and utilizing no third-party tools all built in. So in the demo, the cookies were stolen from a browser that I just mentioned using tools that are kind of built in and potentially found on a developer's workstation. However, this process can also be automated using tools such as White Chocolate Macadamia Nut, written by Justin Bowie. And I'm going to just go ahead and abbreviate that to WCM going forward because I cannot say that many times over. So we could go ahead and, utilizing a slightly different technique here, again, start a browser in headless mode on the victim machine, have it set on the debugging port of 9333. What we can do then is start an SSH tunnel on that same machine, tunneling that local port out to a remote machine. And then on the attacking machine, we could drop the White Chocolate Macadamia Nut tool and connect to the tunnel port instead to steal the browser cookies. And this avoids dropping an extra tool on the victim host. So again, this kind of demonstrates how stealthy this technique can be, especially when it's combined with network tunneling or proxying techniques. And this also demonstrates nicely why there's lots of telemetry involved from various systems and log channels. All that's kind of required for you to actually go ahead and get your arms around this kind of technique. So from the demo, again, we hopefully got a good sense of the danger of cookie theft and how it can be pulled off using tools that are either typically found on a developer's workstation or using tools like WCM. However, luckily not all detection hope is lost. And most of the tools that I know of rely on Chrome or Edge, Chromium browser, being started with a debugging port or injecting something into the browser process, which are all event IDs and things that we can capture and alert on. And for the technique that we just demoed, we can go ahead and alert on a Chromium process being started with a debugging port, as is seen here in the screenshot. So wrapping up and kind of digging a little bit deeper into browser cookie theft, some event IDs that we need or can at least help us wrangle this technique are object auditing events that I talked about. These are your SACL auditing, process events, including parent process and command line values for best results, events that tie together process to network connections. So your system on event ID 3 or anything with a community ID will be really invaluable here. Process injection events like create thread or system on event ID 10 process access are also really important. In terms of detection strategies, we can use the network events to flag on a network connection that is incoming to the browser instead of the normal outgoing. We can also use SACLs to alert us when a non-browser process touches a history or bookmark file. And as shown in the previous slides, we can also alert on the command line parameters and look for Chromium browsers being started with a debugging port being enabled. And finally, we can look at strange or abnormal processes injecting into our browser processes. And again, a super important step here is the validation step. We can use tools like WCM or Sharp Chrome, along with tools like Seatbelt that perform browser enumeration and system enumeration just to generate telemetry that looks malicious so that you can compare, what does it look like when Seatbelt enumerates a browser versus when a user just opens Chrome and browses normally. This is a really, really key step to both threat hunting and detection engineering as well. So wrapping up with some action items. The first action item I have here is incorporating token and cookie theft into both your threat models and playbooks. I think that these techniques are a little bit underappreciated by the blue team community. And it was really exciting to see another talk about cookie theft, I think, during this conference as well, which I'll have to catch after this presentation. But I'm glad that this is getting a little bit more attention because it's a pretty stealthy and deadly technique from a threat actor point of view. The next action item I have here is exploring and operationalizing data sources that you might not have in your environment currently. These are things like Linux logging. Linux systems tend to be pretty critical to networks. However, they are kind of like set off in the corner and never looked at or spoken about ever. So make sure you have, if you do have Linux systems in your network, that you're getting some kind of telemetry from them. AuditD and Laurel are great tools that you can use here. SACL auditing is super important. We covered that pretty heavily during the presentation. File share auditing as well. File share auditing can tend to be a little bit verbose and a little bit difficult to wrangle, but it is well worth the effort, especially if your network is, Active Directory. And the next couple items here are avoiding tunnel vision. And this is kind of over pivoting on the LSASS memory dumping techniques while having, no detections for cookie theft. Small steps are really important here. So just because you don't have all of these data sources enabled right away, that's okay. Start small, that's perfectly fine. And the last point there is to tabletop/purple team cloud authentication scenarios. Find out how your developers, users, administrators are actually performing cloud authentication from their endpoints. I think the answers here will surprise you.